Hi, this is Madison and this is my Chapter 10 video. After reading the studies conducted by James Coleman, Christopher Jenks, and Otis Duncan, it appears that the educational system does not have much of an influence on student academic achievement. I thought this was interesting that the report showed little impact teachers and schools in general had on students. And the main factors these men discussed that accounted for student success were the student's home life and the hereditary influence. These reports kind of shocked me because I was taught in all my college classes and even teaching now how much of an impact you as a teacher will have on students. And it turns out, according to these guys, that this isn't quite true. So discussing the three men, I'll first talk about Coleman. So he found that the effects of the home environment far outweigh the effects that the school or the teacher had on achievement. He found this to be especially true with minority groups. In his report, he concluded that teachers and schools could not account for all the reasons African Americans who were 6 months behind in reading in first grade ended up 3.5 years behind white students in reading in the 12th grade. And I thought that was kind of an interesting finding. Coleman also talked about two key variables that do determine a child's achievement, and those are family background and their social class background. And I can see how this does make sense. I believe that home environment does greatly affect students in a positive or negative way. So for example, if a student comes from a low-income family and the parents have to work all the time to provide for their children, that student may not be receiving the educational support at home. School may be the last thing on that kid's mind. They may be worrying about what to cook for supper and how to take care of their younger siblings. And a school can only provide so much support, and if a student has no influence at home to help them with their studies or reinforce the importance of school, I think that child will be less likely to achieve academic success. Coleman's data leads to the fact that most student output is directly related to student input. I also thought it was interesting that Coleman's study showed that spending money to better the schools actually had no effect. So if all these school improvement strategies such as buying expensive books and computers and getting the best teachers who may cost a little more, or having low student-teacher ratios, if none of these matter according to his findings, the question that I have is how can we help these students then? The next one is Duncan, and Duncan found that education is also not a huge factor in determining the occupation a child will pursue and their income level. He believes variables such as family origin, family education, inherited IQ, and socioeconomic class are the real underlying factors. And like Coleman, Duncan also mentions families that have more money are able to provide more opportunities for their children, such as learning experiences and education. And also children that have parents with higher education are more likely to further their schooling as well. And I do agree with that. I think that's true. Jenks, he also believed that education was not the main factor in determining success a child will have later in their life, such as their occupation. He thought it was mainly due to socioeconomic origin as well. He concluded that the schools do almost nothing to close the gap between the rich and the poor. The quality of education has little effect on what happens to students. School achievement depends largely on a single input, which is family characteristics. About 45% of IQ is determined by heredity, and 35% by environment, and 20% by other factors. And there's no evidence that school reform, so spending the money, can reduce cognitive inequality that exists among students, and Coleman also pointed that out as well. I thought it was interesting that he brought up how educators are not improving the lives of students, but he says, it's not their fault. and how the real problem is the student's home life. I kind of talked about that earlier, but I agree with the studies and how important a child's home life is. He also discusses, like Coleman, that it all boils down to the fact that student input accounts for student output. Another point that Jenks brought up dealt with testing, and he talked about teaching to a test. So even if a teacher does teach to a test and increases the test scores have nothing to do with the students actually finishing their education. And, looking at our state testing, we really push our students to do the best on their tests, but what Jenks found is that these tests will have no long-term effect on students' education. So teaching the test will more likely cause students to forget everything that they should supposedly know when they graduate. So everything, if we teach the test, they just forget it all when they leave school. The last question on how do I think their beliefs compare with the 2015 philosophy of education? I think there's some similarities and differences. I agree with the points brought up in the readings about how much an impact home life has on children. We only have children for about 8 hours a day, and then they're at home for the other 16. And I don't think it's really possible to make a drastic change in that amount of time that we have them. Parents have to step in and be positive role models, and we kind of kid about this in our teaming meetings, but there are parents that we would like to send to parenting classes. Sometimes I think that if the parents change, that would have the most positive impact on students than anything else we could do for them in the school. So I agree with home life and hereditary influences and how they play a big part in student success. Recently in schools, I think that they've gone through some major changes, and especially with technology advancements. My school a couple of years ago bought every student a MacBook Air, and the middle school is also sent to the National Teacher Conference in Minnesota for staff development. So I think schools spending money to better educate students, I don't think these attempts don't have any effect on students. So I would somewhat disagree with their findings on spending money in education and how they think it's a waste of time and money because the students aren't benefiting from it. I think it is important to spend money, but to spend money wisely and so it makes a positive impact on the students. So those are my thoughts on the Chapter 10 assignment. Have a great rest of your day.